Hey guys, each month I'm giving out a 1-year subscription of my online course to a reviewer of my show. The winner for September is Thomas. Okay, so this is the username displayed on iTunes. Thomas, thank you very much for taking the time to write me a review. Please get in touch with me. You can just contact me using the contact form on ChineseTalkEase.com. I'll set up the membership for you. I heard people telling me that this show motivates them to learn Chinese. You know what motivates me to do this show? Your review. So if you're listening, well, of course you are. If you have enjoyed the show and you want to give me a pat on the back, please write me a review on iTunes. I will greatly appreciate that. Also, if you want to learn some vocabulary, make sure you check out my Instagram account, where you will learn 1 word a day from me. And my username on Instagram is Chinese Talk Ease. Now let's start the show. This is Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast, episode number 17.
Embarrassing moment, culture insights, proven methods to achieve Chinese fluency. Skip that learning curve with the Journey to Chinese Fluency Podcast. Now, your host, Victor Yang.
Hello everyone, Victor Yang here, and welcome to Journey to Chinese Fluency. Today I am joined by Laurence Heyes. Laurence is from United Kingdom. His parents currently live in Edinburgh. Laurence has spent 3 years learning Chinese. Apart from English and Chinese, he also speaks Dutch at beginner's level. At the age of 22, Laurence goes to university in London and lived there during term time. However, he is now studying abroad in Beijing. And here are 2 interesting facts about Laurence. Interesting fact number 1. Laurence was born on the New Year's Day. And here's number 2. Laurence likes running half marathons. He has run 3 half marathons and is going to Singapore this December to run another one. 你好, Laurence. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Good to be here.
Are you ready to share with us your journey to Chinese fluency?
Absolutely. Let's start now, shall we?
Awesome. Let's do this. So first of all, please feel free to fill in the blank a bit for the introduction.
So, hello everybody. My name is Laurence. I am a university student. I go to university in London at a small university called SOAS, the School for Oriental and African Studies. It's part of the University of London and it specializes in Asian languages and African languages. The Chinese department, Japanese department and the Korean department are fairly well known. I currently go to university in Beijing at Beijing Normal University. I'm doing a year abroad here and will go back home next summer.
Please first share with our listeners why you learn Chinese.
Okay, so my sort of journey into Chinese is slightly different to perhaps some other people who you've already interviewed or that you will interview in the future. When I was at high school, my biggest love was music. I've played the violin for many years and I can play a little bit of other instruments as well. And when I was in high school, I really wanted to go to a music college, a conservatoire, because I wanted to become a professional musician. So that's what I did. I applied to go to conservatoire when I was 18 and I got a place at a conservatoire in London. But after about a year and a half, I found that I wasn't really enjoying it. And as well as that, a lot of my friends were a couple of years older than me, and I was seeing them graduate and they didn't really have good jobs. They were finding it very hard to get employment, especially good employment. And I have a good example. There's a friend of mine who won an international piano competition and then ended up working in a call center, which is not a very good job, and he didn't really like it. So I kind of thought, I'm not really enjoying it and I haven't really got any good prospects here. So I started thinking about some other options. While I was at music college, I had a good friend from Belgium. And one night I was a bit bored just doing the music, and I thought I should kind of learn something else while I'm here, not just do music, try and maybe learn a new skill, dancing or singing or a bit of language maybe. So I Googled the 10 easiest languages to learn for English speakers. And on the list there was French, there was Spanish, there was German, there was Dutch and other things. And I thought, hey, Dutch, I know nothing about Holland, let's give this a go. So I learned a little bit myself, and I mentioned it to my friend, who I discovered is from the south of Belgium, which means he speaks a dialect of Dutch, a very, very similar dialect. So then I learned a little bit, and I had a chat with him every now and then. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool, actually. I quite enjoy this. So when I thought about leaving music college, I was like, well, I've done a little bit of language, and actually I quite enjoyed it. So I kind of thought, well, I could do language as part of my degree, because another thing I missed was breadth. When I was at high school, it wasn't just music. I had my other subjects as well, right? I thought, okay, so maybe I can do language and something else. So I had a look at courses that offer, they're called 双学位 in Chinese. You do like 2 subjects. So one of them was Chinese, and I thought maybe I can do something else, kind of broad, like business or economics. And when I was looking at languages, I thought Chinese, Japanese, German, they're going to be the ones that will be important. And I just picked Chinese because I thought it would, in the future, it will become the most useful. So that's how I got into Chinese. At the beginning, it was because I thought Chinese will give me better employment opportunities in the future.
Right, that's very interesting. So initially, you just picked the easiest language as an English speaker, so you picked Dutch. And then you,
That's right.
after that, you picked one of the hardest language, which is Chinese.
That's right, yeah.
So what has been your biggest motivation in learning Chinese?
So as I just said at the beginning, it was to sort of get a job, and I didn't really have any particular reasons for learning Chinese. It wasn't because a lot of students here at Beishida, there are some Korean students who really love Chinese food, or there might be someone who really loves Chinese opera. I have a good friend who's quite into Chinese opera, or some people might really love, they might have, worked in a Cantonese restaurant when they were a kid and sort of got into it that way. I just thought about it because, it might help me get a job. But after I started, I actually found it really interesting. And, I've made some really lovely friends through learning Chinese. I've met some really lovely teachers through learning Chinese. Coming here, living in Beijing at the moment, Beijing's pretty cool. It's very different from London. That's been pretty cool. I've learned a lot about a new place. I feel a lot of foreigners love looking around the world and seeing what's out there, whereas a lot of British people don't and just look at what's happening in the UK. So that's been interesting as well. And I met my girlfriend, of course, which has been really lovely. So these sort of more normal things, not because I really, really love China, not at the beginning anyway. I like China now, but these other things have been more important in my journey to learning Chinese.
Right. So did you mention you have a Chinese girlfriend?
I do, that's right, yes.
Did you meet her in London or in Beijing?
I met her in London. We met in quite an interesting way, actually. So what happened is she went to university in London, and there were quite a few Chinese students at her university because it has quite a high ranking on the sort of university rankings list. And Chinese people, when looking at universities, often look at these university ranking lists.
Right.
And they had like a Chinese student society there. And they were looking to organize a spring festival gala, 春节联欢晚会. And they were looking for a foreigner to help them host it. And as my school has quite a famous Chinese department, they got in contact with somebody who they knew who goes to my school. And were like, hey, do you know any foreigners that could maybe help us host this show? And they contacted a friend of mine. He was like, I'm busy, but I'll get Laurence to do it. I bet he'll enjoy doing it. He's already hosted a couple of shows before. So I went and had dinner with the other hosts, and then we paired off into 2. There were 2 lots of 2 of us, two, a boy, a girl, and a girl. And she was my partner in the show, and I met her that way. And then shortly afterwards, we became an item.
Awesome. Definitely some motivation for you in learning Chinese, I guess.
Absolutely. And it has been very helpful. Some people say that the best way to learn Chinese is to get a girlfriend. And maybe it might not be the best way to learn Chinese, but it is certainly helpful. And it's good to have someone that you can chat to all the time without sort of bothering them and stuff. So it is useful. There's no denying that.
Yeah, sure. So now, please share with us your method of learning Chinese. What's been the most effective technique or method that's been working for you?
So, can we split it into different bits? Should we go through maybe what I did at the beginning and then what I did for different aspects? Okay. So at the very beginning, I sort of had a vague idea of what I wanted to learn. So some people really like songs and want to understand songs. Some people really like literature and want to understand literature. Some people like novels. Some people like TV shows. So depending on what you like and what you want to do, your goals will differ. And then because of that, your method will differ as well. But for me, is I wanted to chat to people, make some friends and, read some books and stuff. So nothing particularly difficult. So I thought, well, if I want to read, I've got to start learning some characters. So a lot of Western students, when they learn Chinese, will learn pinyin at the very beginning. Pinyin is very important and very useful, but a lot of Westerners make the mistake in thinking that pinyin is Chinese. Pinyin is not Chinese. Pinyin is just an input method. So a lot of Westerners rely very heavily on pinyin when they start, and they never really learn characters. That's a mistake that I fortunately didn't make, but a lot of Westerners do make. So fine, learn pinyin. It takes you about 2 hours if you put some effort in. But then after you've got the hang of pinyin, you really should start learning the characters quite soon, which is what I did. So within 2 or 3 weeks, I was learning some characters, and I started off with the most basic characters. I started off with wo, ni, ta, and then I just write them out like Chinese kids do on paper, and I'd gradually learn more and more. At the beginning, I thought it was really difficult. My goodness, xie, how many strokes does that have? But after a while, you gradually get the hang of it, and the more you learn, the easier it gets. So maybe at the beginning, I was learning 1 or 2 characters a day. Maybe the first day it was wo and ni, and the second day it was ta and ta, the male and female version, and then I'd gradually learn more and then revise the ones I'd already learned and keep going on like that.
So you mentioned that writing character at the beginning is very important. Why do you think that way?
Not necessarily writing characters, but I think that being able to recognize characters is important. There is a big difference between being able to recognize characters and being able to handwrite characters. My handwriting is not great, actually. I think recognizing them is important because if you want to text Chinese, even texting Chinese friends, they text each other in characters. They don't text each other in pinyin. A lot of foreigners make the mistake thinking, these people, they text each other in pinyin and they use pinyin in their daily lives. They don't. It's just a way of texting people and typing on a computer. People use characters. So being able to read the characters, I think, is important, but being able to handwrite them at the beginning isn't so important. I just used handwriting as a way to learn the characters. Now there are other ways of learning characters. There are apps you can get on your phone for learning characters. There are games you can play on the internet for learning characters. I just, like a Chinese child, learnt by writing them out.
Right, that's very interesting. So you made the distinction between being able to recognize a character and being able to write a character. See, this is very true because I remember back then when I just came to Australia, I was very good at writing characters. Now, being in Melbourne, Australia for 16 years, I kind of forget a lot of characters already. I can't even remember how to write those. Sometimes, when I have to write a birthday card for someone, I have to write characters, and sometimes I just find myself forget how to write certain characters. I have to look up on my phone and then copy it out.
That's right, but I think that's a very normal problem. And as a learner of Chinese, as a foreign learner of Chinese, if you see that happening to Chinese people, when it happens to you, you feel less stupid. It's not like it's something that only happens to foreigners. It happens to many Chinese people as well. And you're right, there is a big difference. You learn it very quickly. There is a big difference between writing characters, being able to write characters, and being able to read characters.
Yes, definitely. So what have been your strategy to work on your listening?
Listening. So at the very beginning, I was, when I had learnt a little bit of Dutch, when I was learning a bit of Dutch, I found that understanding what people were saying was quite difficult. And if I didn't understand what the person was saying to me, I couldn't really have a conversation with them. I'd already realized that listening was quite an important part of learning a language. And then when I was learning Chinese, I was looking for some basic stuff that I could use to sort of learn how to understand the language. So I bought some really simple stories. The series was called Chinese Breeze. I can't remember the publishing house that they came from, but the series was called Chinese Breeze in Chinese Hanyu Feng. And they all came with CDs, and the stories were very short, and the chapters were even shorter. So the chapters might be 1 or 2 pages long. And I'd work through a chapter, reading the text in characters. There was no pinyin in these stories, which I think is very important. I'd work through the chapters, and then I might see a new word, for example, 学校, which means school. So I'd write, okay, so that's 学校, and I'd learn how to write 学校, and I'd learn how to recognize it, and then I'd learn how to understand it. Then after reading this for maybe, an hour, getting through 1 page, I'd listen to the recording many, many times. And then I'd read the text at the same time and go through the recording and the text. And then after that, I might, say, go to the supermarket, and while I was buying stuff for dinner, I might listen to Chinese at the same time. And then I just kind of do it that way. I remember at the beginning it being very difficult to understand, like, how can this be a language? This is just blah, 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 blah. But eventually it does become clearer. But that was an important thing. I started with these basic stories and I used to work through them. I might say spend 5 days on one chapter, listen to it again and again and again and again. And then when I kind of thought I had the hang of it, I would move on to the next chapter. And using the same method, reading it, learning the new words, then maybe say there'll be 后天 in the next chapter, in 2 days from now. Okay, so that's a new word, and I'd learn how to write that, I'd learn how to understand it, and gradually expand my vocabulary that way. And then after you sort of get to a certain level, you can kind of start having conversations with people, basic conversations with people, and then you can learn by practice. So you speak to your friends, they see something you don't know, you'll be like, oh, what does that mean? And you can write a list out and sort of gradually expand your vocabulary that way.
Right, that's a very good method in my opinion.
I can just comment on speaking briefly. I'm quite fortunate in the fact that my parents live in Edinburgh and I live in London. And there are quite a lot of Chinese students at Edinburgh University. It's a very good university. And there are even more Chinese students in London because most of the best universities in the UK are in London. So there are quite a lot of Chinese people that you can find if you want to go and practice Chinese. But I know that some people say, oh, there are no Chinese people where I live, or I don't know any Chinese people, or they might all speak Cantonese because a lot of restaurant owners speak Cantonese, or they might speak dialect even. So what I used to use at the beginning was a website called italki.com, italki.com. And it's kind of like how would I describe it? It's a website, it's kind of like a language learning Facebook. So lots of people who want to learn languages go and register for the website, and then you can find a language partner on the website. So you might Skype them once a week in English and once a week in Chinese. You know, there are a lot of Chinese people who want to learn English. If your native language is English, you have a slight advantage. Or you can even look for a teacher on the website, and you might pay them $10 for an hour, and they'd speak to you very patiently and help you with what you don't understand. So that was a method I used a lot as well. In first year at university, I didn't know too many Chinese people, so that was something I used on a regular basis.
All right. In terms of reading, how did you approach that?
Reading. So I think that the stories I started with were quite good, and I said earlier there was no pinyin in the books, which is really important because that got me reading characters from an early stage. Apart from reading is very tough with Chinese because the difference between spoken Chinese and written Chinese is very large. So if I pick up a novel or if I pick up a newspaper and I speak Chinese very well, I won't necessarily, even if I recognize all the characters, understand what it's saying because it's written in a different style and different words are used for different things. So that can be quite a problem, which leads to a lot of textbooks being written in colloquial Chinese, which is fine. But what I find in textbooks, to be not particularly authentic, or the language is a bit not real, and people don't really speak like that. So one of the best things I found was texting my friends. So everyone in China uses WeChat. So, you know, I text my friends and I thought, well, if my friends say this, everybody probably says this. So that's probably a word I need to know. Or, you know, my friend uses this idiom quite a lot. That's probably a commonly used idiom. I should probably learn that. And then gradually, you know, you talk about the same things on a regular basis. What did you do today? How did you sleep? What's the weather like today? And you get the hang of these things. And then gradually you can move on to more complex subjects. So that was a really, really good method. I had some friends that I text regularly and just learn, you know, from what they would say. And that was really, really useful. That was really, really useful. I'm very glad I did that.
So when you were texting your friends, did you all use Chinese?
We'd speak in English sometimes, but we'd usually speak in Chinese.
So you already have a considerable amount of vocabulary when you start texting your friends?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you're asking someone how the weather is and what they did today, you don't really need a massive vocabulary. But you can learn quite quickly that way, I feel. So you haven't got to be at a particularly high level to text your friends. It depends what you speak about. But you gradually get better. And if you text your friends, if you don't understand it, you can just put it in a dictionary and look up the words, and then you can keep texting them.
That's a very good way to study. So once you have passed your beginner level, did you use any other methods to study?
Yeah, so if we stay on reading, once it got to the point when I could understand most of what my friends would text me, and then Facebook, I know Facebook is not used in China, but a lot of Taiwanese people use Facebook. When you sort of understand what people are writing on Facebook and that kind of fairly colloquial language, once you get the hang of that, then you can start reading sort of some kind of book. And the best thing I found is comics. The best thing I found for intermediate learners of Chinese is Japanese manga translated into Chinese. Because the language is more formal than you'd expect, but it's not written in a really formal style, and it's not written in like a really literary style with lots of fancy words and idioms. So the good thing about manga is it's the dialogue boxes, what the characters say is written in fairly colloquial Chinese. So that's good. But the narration, you know, the next day or in the hospital or, you know, when it's sort of talking about where things are happening. That's often written in more formal Chinese. So you often understand the dialogue boxes, but there are bits you don't understand. So there are not too many things that are new and difficult to understand. So it's like a good stepping stone to reading books. So one of the first comics I read was Death Note, which I presume you've heard of. It's very famous in China.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then another one I read was Bakuman, which in Chinese is translated as Bao Man Wang.
Okay.
And then I'm reading one at the moment called Monster, 怪物, which is, again, a good comic. But that's been really helpful.
That's very interesting you use comics. I didn't realize comics is a good way to learn. Now when I think about it, it's very true because there is part of the quote and there's part of the narration. Yeah. And it's written very easy to understand. You know, it can't be very difficult because it's entertainment. If it is very difficult, very formal language, it will become boring.
That's right, and that's one of the best part about comics. When I read things in textbooks, I don't want to criticize the teaching methods here at the school, but some of the stuff we read, I'm like, oh my God, are we actually going to read this? Like, I want to read something cool and interesting, right? And if I read a comic, I'm like, oh man, this is so cool. So that can be another motivation to keep you going. And another good thing about comics, sometimes when you see like a whole page of Chinese, you're like, wow, like this is going to take me an hour to get through this. It can be quite intimidating. But with comics, it's all written in little small chunks. So there'll be like 2 lines here and then like 2 lines over on the left-hand side of the page and then another 2 lines further down. Reading it in small chunks makes you feel less scared.
You can definitely put more focus on reading comics. You won't get burned out by doing that because it's entertainment. It's not boring. So if you just study some textbook, that can be really dry, really boring, and you may burn out one day. But reading comics books is definitely a fun way to learn Chinese.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Do you have any other tips for the learners?
Yeah, so one of the things I've used during my journey in learning Chinese is I've kind of referenced what other people have used in their journey in learning Chinese, or what other people like doing when they're learning languages. So nowadays there are quite a few famous people who speak very, very good Chinese on the internet. One of the best ones is a Canadian guy called Steve Kaufman, who does speak Chinese fairly well, and he's perfectly able to have a conversation with you. And you can look at his videos. He'll make videos about language learning, and I've learned quite a lot from what he said. So if listeners want to sort of reference his videos, they're more than welcome to do that. They can be found on YouTube. He's quite interesting. And there's another guy as well who lived in Taiwan for, I think, about 5 years, whose name is Vladimir Skoltetti, I think. I'll send the information to Victor later on so we can put it in a blog post. But There are some other famous people. I might put a list of them down. But there's these people who are on the internet who share their methods. And you can always, because listening to just one person's methods is never enough, you can reference what these people have to say, and that might be even more useful for your listeners.
Awesome. I'll definitely link that in the show notes. So, what have been your biggest challenge in learning Chinese, and how did you overcome it?
I think the biggest challenge in learning Chinese is just it's really hard to get off the ground. It's really hard at the beginning. And there are so many things pushing you down. Like, it's not just that, for example, when you're learning Dutch, the pronunciation is a little bit hard, but even if you pronounce Dutch with a really strong foreign accent, they'll still understand you. And, so the writing system is the same. You don't have to learn all these characters. So it's very hard to get off the ground in Chinese, and it can be quite intimidating. But what I'd say is just try and gradually sort of make progress, take it one step at a time, and you'll eventually sort of get there. I think there isn't really one biggest challenge. I think the whole thing's a challenge, and there are a lot of challenges at the beginning. But if you just take it one step at a time and gradually overcome these barriers, that can be useful. Something I use when I find things becoming intimidating, like I might be like, oh, my grammar is really bad, and oh, my pronunciation is wrong, and oh, I made this mistake today, and everything is terrible. I'll just calm down and think, okay, so for the next 2 weeks, I'll concentrate on this one aspect. I might say this word wrong on a regular basis. Okay, this week I'm going to say it right every time I say it. And then the next week it might be, okay, so I sometimes make this mistake, so let's concentrate on this mistake this week. And then the third week it might be something else. And then the fourth week I might try and do all three and sort of revise what I've just done and then gradually move on. So taking it one step at a time like this makes things seem less intimidating, and you'll gradually get the hang of all these things. That's a tip I've used myself.
That's a great way to tackle this type of problems, I guess. When you see a problem that is very big, you just focus on one thing at a time. I guess in terms of, using a computer science term, that is called the divide and conquer method.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
You divide a big problem into smaller chunks and conquer each one of those.
That's right. Yes.
During your study of Chinese, did you get to deal with any accent or dialects?
I have. This happened to me very recently, actually. I only got to Beijing about a week ago.
Right.
And right at the beginning, I was doing lots of stuff. I had to register. I had to get my room key. I had to go and do a health check. I had to get a SIM card and things like that. And when I went to get my SIM card, I went to, my friend said I should go to one particular phone shop. He said, this one's better than the other two. So I went there. And when I went there, the guy was like, give me your fuzhao. And my listening skills are actually quite good in Chinese now. So I was like, my what? And he was like, give me your fuzhao. And I was like, I swear I've never learned that word before. And he was like, give me your fuzhao. And only like 20 minutes later did I realize he was asking for my passport, because he used to get he would get f and h mixed up.
Really?
So, if you've never heard these things before, sometimes you just can't understand what they're saying. But you've written, you sort of asked me here, how do you deal with that? And one of the things that you have to do is just try and learn what mistakes people will make. So some people get f and h mixed up. So if someone asks me again for my fuzhao, I'll be like, oh, so that might be an F or it might be an H. And I'll look away like, fuzhao, no, huzhao, okay, passport, that's what he wants. I was in Changsha last year and someone said to me, do you want to drink liu lai? I already knew that they meant niu nai, because people in Changsha sometimes get the n and l mixed up. So one of the best things to do is try and learn the mistakes people make and then just sort of guess at what they're saying. So people from I had a really good Taiwanese friend, and I used to find it very hard to tell when she was saying si and when she was saying shi. But you just have to kind of guess. And if you really don't understand them, just ask them to say it again. I'll write it down for you. But it can be hard. I regularly don't understand what people are saying to me if they have a really strong accent. And the other thing you can do is, it's wrong to pick your friends on how they speak, but picking your friends on how they speak does have advantages to it. So my girlfriend speaks incredibly clearly. We don't have any problems. I have no problems understanding her because she speaks incredibly clearly. Another friend I had in London, even though she was from Kunming in the south of China, where they often have a bit of a dialectical accent, she spoke very clearly too. So I got on with them better because I can just understand what they're saying. So even though that's a bit of a mean thing to do, pick people on how they speak, it can be useful.
Very good method there, because you mentioned that being able to pick out how people make mistakes, that is a very good method in my opinion, so that you know what to expect, rather than just make mistakes all the time until you learn it. At least that is a starting point.
Yeah, and you can Google it, or you can, on the Chinese version of Google, Baidu, you can search sort of the mistakes that people might make. So I mentioned that one is n and l. If you live near Shanghai, people often forget to add in Chinese, it's called hou bi yin. So the nasal sound at the end of words. So in Chinese, there's a sound an and there's a sound ang. One has a g at the end. They might sometimes forget that. So again, if you sort of hear someone say something like 产生, you'd be like, oh, okay, they mean 产生. And the more you hear it, the more you get used to it. But you can Google it. You'll find information about it on the internet.
Yep, that's true. See, it's very interesting because myself, being a native Chinese, I don't realize these things because oftentimes I have the vocabulary with me already. I already know the words. And when people say that, I already expect it. But for people who don't have the vocabulary, you probably don't expect, they to say that in a different pronunciation. And even it's just a very little difference in terms of pronunciation, it can make a huge difference.
That's right. At the beginning, there isn't really much you can do about it. At the beginning, you're just going to have trouble understanding. But if you even if you just make a note of what happened, okay, so my friend said, let's use the same example, 产生. Okay, so next time I hear someone say that, they probably mean 产生. You sort of gradually get the hang of it. I think you can say that.
Yes. Cool. So if you are to start learning Chinese from scratch all over again, how would you do it?
I don't want to sound arrogant, but I feel like I did it pretty well. I feel like the way I went about it was fairly effective and is still fairly effective. What would I have done differently? Perhaps I might have started reading comics earlier. I remember after I finished reading the series called Chinese Breeze, I bought some kids' novels that I read as a kid, translated into Chinese, written by an author called Roald Dahl, who's a famous English author. And I read through them, and I didn't really understand what they were saying. I just kind of, wrote all the words I didn't know and just forgot everything that was in the books. Not particularly effective. So I would have probably tried to find something that was sort of the next level. They were too hard for me, so something that was at my level and then gradually learn like that. So had I found comics earlier, that would have been more effective. But generally speaking, I feel like I've used a fairly effective method.
I think I agree with you. You're doing pretty well. In just 3 years, you're speaking really good Chinese, in my opinion.
Hopefully it will continue to get better.
Yeah. Well, now, tell us a success story, a most rewarding moment after you have become fluent in Chinese.
One of the best things I did was participate in a show, a competition called Chinese Bridge. In Chinese, it's called Hanyu Qiao, which is a competition for university students who speak Chinese and often study Chinese at university. So in my first year at university, I did the British competition. I didn't really have any expectations. I thought I'll try, see how I do. If I win, I win. If I lose, I lose. And I came second in the British competition, which meant I got an opportunity to go to China last summer. And I participated in the international competition and did fairly well in that. I think I came about 16th in the world. So that was a really experience. And again, going back to what we said earlier, what have been motivations for you learning Chinese? In that competition, I met some wonderful people and made some wonderful friends. So doing things like that can be a way of giving yourself more motivation. That was a very rewarding experience.
Yeah, definitely a rewarding moment. So what are you doing with your Chinese now?
I'm studying, as I said, at Beishida in Beijing, and then after I finish here, I will go back to London to finish my degree, and then after that, I'll start looking for a job. I'm not that sure about what I want to do. I've thought about maybe working in media. I've thought about maybe working in trade. I've thought about maybe even working for the British government. The British government has offices in foreign countries where they try and sort of make the relationship between Britain and said foreign country better. And now with Britain leaving the European Union, or soon leaving the European Union, a lot of British companies and the British government is looking to try and build a better relationship with China. So there are more opportunities in that area now. So that might be something I'll look into.
Cool. Sounds like a great area to get into because you have the advantage in Chinese and there's really not that many people who have the skills. So
I've actually been very surprised. So I've only been here for, as I said, a week or 2 weeks or something. But there are now a lot of foreigners who speak really very good Chinese. I think maybe 5 years, 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there weren't that many people who spoke very good Chinese, or if they did, they weren't very well known. But nowadays, I've met especially people, Korean people. I've met a frightening number of Korean people who speak phenomenal Chinese. So perhaps they don't get as much attention in the media because they're not white or Caucasian.
Yeah.
But there are a lot now.
How would you compare your life before you've learned Chinese and your life after you have learned Chinese?
I think the biggest difference is that learning Chinese has opened my eyes to the world a bit. In Chinese, you'd say, 开阔了我的眼界. So you sort of have a wider outlook on life now. And it's been very interesting. Even though at high school and middle school and primary school, I did learn a little bit about foreign countries, and we study European history and British history. I was never really that interested in these things. But I feel like now I have a slightly more diverse life, and I sort of get the best of both worlds. So I think, generally speaking, my life is better, and I'm certainly more happy. Certainly happier now that I've learned Chinese and can speak Chinese. So yeah, I would say it's generally been a really good experience.
That's great. So now please share with us one special thing about the Chinese culture that is different to your own culture.
I'm going to say the same thing I said about the making mistakes. I feel like a lot of people say that, the cultural difference is so big. And in fact, it was in the same interview, Da Shan, he said that when Western people look at Chinese people, they think of them as 特别神秘, very kind of...
mysterious.
How do you translate? Mysterious. Yeah, very mysterious. And, everything is 孔子曰 and sort of very, very ancient and sort of even 崇高. But, and then Chinese people look at Western people and think Western people are really weird. But actually, people are people and everyone's kind of similar. We have different ways of doing things. Chinese people eat rice. We eat bread, but they're all carbohydrates. So there are small differences, but generally what we're doing is similar.
Yep.
But one thing that does irritate me, or that I do notice, is sharing food. So in Chinese culture, you know, when you all go out for dinner, you'll order maybe 10 things between 8 people, and everyone will have a bit of everything. Whereas in Western culture, when you go out for dinner, everyone orders their own thing and eats their own thing. And I find it very hard to share my food because I ordered this because I want to eat it. I don't want to give it to you. You ordered that because you want to eat it. And now you're eating my dinner. So I find that quite difficult. My girlfriend's very good. She kind of understands that and kind of lets me eat my own thing. But since being here, I've had to make a special effort to share my food, which I find hard. That is one thing that is particularly evident for me.
Personally, when I just came to Australia, I was working as a waiter in a restaurant, and as a waiter, I have to ask people if you want to share or you want to just eat for yourself. Because it was a Chinese restaurant, most of the people coming in was Chinese, but then there were groups of Australian, right, coming in to have their dinner. And then when I ask, are you happy to share or do you want to eat your own stuff? And then, you know, people just gave me a weird look. What? Share? You know, it's like, I was like, is that something that's illogical or something? You know, did I say something wrong? You know, I was kind of shocked, actually. I was kind of shocked to realize that, you know, the culture is really different. You know, people don't share food when they eat together. But in China, it would be weird if you just eat your own share. It's just, it's just very, very different on that aspect.
That's right. That is right. That has been something that I've noticed, and that is something that I, generally speaking, I don't deliberately make an effort to do anything particularly differently. I just kind of be me. But when I go out for dinner, I do have to kind of consciously remind myself, okay, right, so we've got to share the food now. But it's not a massive difference.
Yeah, I know. Now I learned to eat my own share as well. So, do you have a favorite city in China?
In China, last year I went to Shanghai, and I thought Shanghai was really cool. I think Shanghai is kind of like Asia for beginners. It is Chinese, and it's clearly a Chinese city, but there are lots of Western things as well. So if you go to a strange place, you can't say strange, if you go to a foreign place, you might miss home. So sort of Shanghai has the best of both worlds in the sense that it's very much a Chinese city, but it has many, many global aspects to it. So if you sort of just come, it can be a good way of gently breaking yourself into a new culture. Beijing here is nice, although I do find that the pollution's a bit of an issue. I'm not particularly fond of that. It's actually quite bad today. The sky's quite grey today. It's a bit better now. It was grey earlier. And I've been to Hong Kong as well. Hong Kong's a nice place. A bit too expensive for me, I think. And then this summer I went to Taipei in Taiwan, which was really lovely. I think Taipei is probably the favourite place I've been so far.
Is there a tool, an app, or a website that you cannot live without in learning Chinese?
Yes, and I think that most Chinese learners will give you the same answer. And they're going to say an app called Pleco, Pleco, which is a Chinese dictionary. It's an app on your phone, and it's incredibly useful. It's probably the most comprehensive dictionary I've ever come across. Apart from Pleco, there's a good website called archchinese.com, which not many of my friends use. So what it does is when you look up a character, it will come up with like an animated picture, and the picture will show you how to write the character. It will show you the stroke order. And then after I sort of watched like 1,000 or 2,000 of these images, you kind of gradually learn just how to write characters. You haven't got to look it up every time. So seeing these drawings has been really helpful in learning how to write characters properly. And then the final two, WeChat, of course. You can't really talk to anybody if you've not got WeChat in China. And then italki, again, the website that I used when I was a first year. Those have been the 4 things I used the most.
Great suggestions. So if you are to recommend to our listeners one book in learning Chinese or the Chinese culture, what would that be?
So I'll probably recommend the books I've read. So I'd recommend Hanyu Feng, Chinese Breeze. Those books were good. There's a whole series of them. And they're not too expensive either. After that, I read Death Note, which in Chinese is called 死亡笔记本. That's a good comic series. I read Bakuman, which is called Bao Man Wang. I'm reading a book called Monster at the moment, which is called 怪物. And another comic I read this summer is called 天上之贤, which in English is called The Man Who Headed Towards the Life of Stradivari, which sounds like an odd translation.
Wow.
But it's about It's about a Korean boy who becomes a violin maker, and it talks about his life. He was born in the era of Hirohito, Zhao He, when Japan invaded Korea. So he learnt Japanese at school, and he had a very tough life from a very poor family. But in the end, he becomes a very famous violin maker. That was a really interesting read.
Some interesting books. Awesome. So now, please teach our listeners your favorite Chinese quote, phrase, or expression.
So I picked two little bits of poetry out that I think are fairly commonly used. So the first one is 海内存知己，天涯若比邻, which is a phrase that means something like, even though we may be in different places, our hearts are still together. So it's often used when talking about friendship. So I'm here, you're in Australia, we're a long way apart, but we're still good friends. We sort of feel like neighbors. It has that kind of feeling to it. And the second one is 长风破浪会有时，直挂云帆济沧海. Did I say that wrongly?
Yeah, it's good. Right? Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Which is a phrase from a poem. I can't remember who wrote it. Who wrote the poem?
I'm not sure, actually. You got me on that.
Okay. It might be Li Bai. I'm not entirely sure. But it basically means that we will encounter lots of setbacks, and there might be some difficulties on the road, but eventually you will get to the other side. In this poem, it's talking about the coast. You'll eventually get to land from the sea. But it basically means it'll be difficult, but you will get there eventually, which is an important piece of advice in doing anything.
Yeah, it's actually written by Li Bai. Yes. It is from the poem called 行路难.
Okay.
So if you are to give our listeners one single piece of advice in learning Chinese, what would that be?
I think work on your listening comprehension and vocabulary. I feel like if you look at language learning in the most simple sense, you can split it into two parts. Input and output. So what comes in and what you put out. And what you put out can always be simple, but what comes at you, you have no means of controlling. So you want to understand what comes at you. You want to understand what you hear. You want to understand what you read. So a lot of people emphasize grammar when they learn languages, and I'm not really that fond of grammar. I find it kind of boring and quite complicated. So what I'd emphasize is learn words, learn to understand, learn to read. And then once you've got that, you can gradually work on what you say later. So long as you understand what people are saying to you, you can chat with them, they can be your friends. If you don't, it's going to be very difficult.
Great advice. So just before we let you go, how can our listeners reach you?
So two good ways of getting hold of me. I myself have an account on Weibo, which is a little bit like a Chinese version of Twitter, I think. So on Weibo, you can find me under 英国和安杰. So 英国, the UK, and 和 is 任何的和, an is 晚安的安, and then 节 is 杰出的节, those three characters. That's one way. And the second way is myself and my girlfriend sometimes make some videos on a Chinese website called Beijing or Bilibili. And our show is, if you look up 安杰和静初, you'll find it. So An is the same. An in my name, so is 杰, He, and 静初, her name is 安静的静, but the character is the one with the Li, 偏旁, 立马的立 on the left hand side. And then 初 is最初的初, beginning. So if you look up that on Bijan or on Google or something, you'll probably find our show, and you can get hold of us there.
Yes, I will definitely link that in our show note. Awesome. Thank you so much, Laurence, for sharing so much valuable information and tips to our listeners.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
To our listeners, the show note is now available at ChineseTalkEase.com/17. TalkEase is spelled as Talkeze. Do you want to learn Chinese for free? Start your own journey to Chinese fluency with my video lessons at ChineseTalkEase.com. TalkEase is spelled as Talkeze. Also remember to join our Facebook group. Just head over to TalkChineseCommunity.com. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. Each month, I will choose one reviewer and give out a 1-year subscription to all my premium video lessons for free. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next episode.